Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to take a deep dive into a concept
Yeah.
that has shaped civilizations, and honestly, it's sparked a lot of debates.
Mm-hmm.
Logos.
Logos, yeah.
We'll be exploring Eugene Michael Jones's book,
Okay.
Logos Rising,
Mm-hmm.
A History of Ultimate Reality.
Right.
And this book, it takes us on a journey through philosophy and religion and history and science.
I mean, it's amazing how Jones connects all these different fields, through this idea of logos.
Yeah.
He traces it from ancient Greece, like all the way to the present day.
Wow.
And he argues that it's really at the heart of how we understand reality itself.
So let's start at the beginning,
Okay.
ancient Greece.
Yeah.
Now, I know the pre-Socratic philosophers were really trying to figure out the basic building blocks of the universe, things like water or air.
Right, right.
So where does logos fit into all of that?
Well, it's a real game changer because before philosophers like Heraclitus, the focus was mainly on material explanations for the universe. But then Heraclitus comes along and says, hey, there's something more to it than just stuff.
Okay.
So he introduces this concept of logos,
Okay.
and it's this underlying principle of order and rationality that governs the universe.
Interesting.
Yeah, you can almost imagine it as like a cosmic blueprint
Okay.
that's guiding this constant flow of change all around us.
So instead of just asking, what is the universe made of?
Right.
Heraclitus is asking, what makes the universe tick?
Exactly.
Oh.
And this shift in thinking, it really had a huge ripple effect on Western thought.
Interesting.
Yeah, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they all grappled with this idea of logos and incorporated it into their own philosophies.
Okay, so we've got this abstract concept of cosmic order.
Right.
How does that connect to Christianity?
Yeah.
Did the early Christians just kind of adopt logos from the Greeks?
Well, it was a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah.
I mean, if I think about the Apostle Paul,
Okay.
he was trying to spread Christianity in a world that was already steeped in Greek thought. And he really tried to bridge this gap between philosophy and theology. And his sermon at the Areopagus in Athens was a great example of this,
Okay.
where he's trying to explain Christianity to a bunch of Greek philosophers.
Ooh, that must have been a tough crowd.
Yeah, trying to explain a personal God
Right.
to people who are so used to thinking of God as like a distant, unmoved mover.
Totally, yeah.
So there were definitely some sticking points there.
I can imagine.
Like one of the biggest challenges was reconciling this Christian idea of a God who actively intervenes in human history
Okay.
with the idea of a God who's more of a distant force. It's almost like trying to explain a hands-on parent
Yeah.
to someone who only knows absentee landlords.
Okay, so how did Christianity eventually integrate logos into its own theology?
Well, Paul laid some of the groundwork, but it
Mhm.
was really the Gospel of John that took the leap.
Okay.
They explicitly identify Christ as the Logos. So Logos wasn't just an abstract principle anymore. It was a person, a God who entered into human history.
Okay, so logos has gone from cosmic blueprint to a divine being.
Yeah.
That's a big transformation.
It is.
The story doesn't end there though, right?
No.
Where does Jones take us next?
Next, we venture into the world of Islamic philosophy, which was actually heavily influenced by Greek thought.
Oh, okay.
Thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes, they really wrestled with logos,
Okay.
especially when trying to reconcile it with their own understanding of God.
So what were the specific challenges they faced?
Mm-hmm.
Was their approach to logos similar at all to the Christian interpretation?
Well, they were dealing with similar questions,
Okay.
but their approach was definitely distinct.
Okay.
They explored concepts like necessary being as proof for God's existence,
Okay.
but they hit a roadblock when it came to understanding the relationship between God and creation.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? What's
So-
the roadblock they encountered?
Well, a core issue for Islamic philosophers was this emphasis on God's absolute unity and transcendence.
Okay.
This made it tricky to reconcile with the idea of a God who actively interacts with the world.
Right.
An idea that's really essential for understanding things like creation and secondary causality.
Okay, so the concept of secondary causality, meaning that God sets things in motion,
Yeah,
but then those things can act on each other independently.
precisely.
Okay.
And according to Jones, this struggle with integrating logos into Islamic theology, it actually had pretty long-lasting consequences.
Interesting.
He argues that it led to a shift in Islamic thought away from these big questions about metaphysics and towards a greater focus on jurisprudence and casuistry, which deals with like ethical decision-making in specific cases.
So instead of focusing on what's the nature of reality,
Right.
the focus shifted to, like, what are the rules? And this shift, Jones argues, may have contributed to the absence of a full-fledged scientific revolution in the Islamic world. Wait, hold on. Are we saying that the concept of logos is directly tied to the development of science?
That's one of Jones's most provocative arguments.
Okay.
He suggests that a robust understanding of secondary causality, something that logos enables, is really essential for the scientific method.
That's a fascinating connection.
It is.
So while logos faced some challenges in the Islamic world, it seems to have thrived in Europe, setting the stage for the scientific revolution.
Yeah.
What factors allowed logos to flourish in Europe and eventually lead to such a radical shift in our understanding of the world?
Well, that's where we'll pick up in part 2, when we explore the figures who challenged the prevailing Aristotelian worldview and paved the way for a new era of scientific discovery.
Can't wait to dive into that.
Yeah.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're exploring the concept of logos, and last time we traced its journey from ancient Greece through early Christianity and into the world of Islamic philosophy. We left off with this idea that the suppression of logos in the Islamic world may have actually played a role in their scientific progress, taking a different path than in Europe.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to consider those what-if scenarios in history.
Totally.
While Islamic thought kind of took one turn, Europe was going through its own transformation,
Okay.
which led to the scientific revolution, and
Yeah.
Jones directly links that to the concept of logos.
Okay, so let's dig into that connection.
Okay.
What was happening in Europe that allowed logos to flourish and ultimately give rise to this new way of understanding the world?
Well, I think we need to look at the figures who challenge the dominant Aristotelian worldview.
Okay.
They paved the way for thinkers like Galileo Copernicus and Newton,
Okay.
people like Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, and John Bredin.
Those names don't exactly roll off the tongue.
I know, right?
Can you give us a sense of who these guys were and what made them so important in this story of logos?
Yeah, they were pushing the boundaries of both philosophical and scientific thought. And one key movement during this time was nominalism,
Okay.
which had a huge impact on how people viewed the relationship between faith and reason.
Okay. I'm going to need a little refresher on nominalism.
Sure.
It's one of those concepts that's always kind of in the back of my mind, but a bit fuzzy around the edges.
Essentially, nominalism is the idea that universals don't actually exist outside the human mind.
Okay.
They're just names we give to things.
Okay.
So like these big abstract concepts, like justice or beauty,
Yeah.
they don't have some real objective existence out there in the world.
So if universals don't really exist, then how can we know anything for certain?
Right. It was a radical idea for the time.
Yeah.
And it led to a growing skepticism about the power of reason alone to understand the world.
Okay.
Because if we can't rely on these grand universal truths, then how do we make sense of things?
I could see how that might open the door to a new way of thinking.
Yeah.
One that's less reliant on abstract reasoning
Mm-hmm.
and more focused on observing the world around us.
You're right on the mark.
Okay, this questioning of reason's limits is precisely what paved the way for the scientific revolution.
Interesting.
If reason alone can't give us certainty, then we need to turn to empirical observation, experimentation, testing hypotheses in the real world.
Okay.
And that's exactly what figures like Galileo and Newton did.
Right.
They ushered in this new era of scientific discovery.
So in a sense, nominalism helped create the conditions for logos to take on a new form,
Yes,
one that embraced observation and experimentation.
precisely. And according to Jones, this shift represents a crucial turning point in the history of logos.
Okay.
It's a move from a more contemplative, philosophical understanding of the world to a more active, empirical one.
Okay, I'm with you so far.
There.
We've gone from ancient Greek philosophy to early Christianity through the Islamic world,
Yep.
and now we're seeing logos take root and evolve in the heart of the scientific revolution.
It's quite a journey.
It is. What happens next in this grand narrative of logos?
From here, Jones takes us into the realm of modern philosophy.
Focusing on figures like Descartes, Vico Kant, and Hegel.
Okay.
And this is where things get really interesting because we start to see the traditional concept of logos kind of unravel in some pretty surprising ways.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's start with Descartes.
Okay.
He's the I think, therefore I am guy, right?
Yes. Descartes is famous for his emphasis on the cogito, the thinking self.
Okay.
And this focus had enormous implications for how we understand the relationship between the mind and body,
Okay.
and ultimately between subjective experience and objective reality.
So Descartes is pushing this idea that our minds, our thoughts and perceptions are somehow separate from the physical world.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Jones argues that this represents a further step away from the traditional understanding of logos
Okay.
as that unifying principle, as something that connects us to the order of the cosmos. It's like we're starting to see a crack appear between our inner world and the outer world.
That's a fascinating observation.
It is.
So while the scientific revolution was using logos to understand the physical world, Descartes is inadvertently taking us in a different direction.
Yeah.
Focusing on the subjective experience of the individual mind.
Precisely. And this shift towards individual subjectivity sets the stage for some of the challenges that logos faces in the modern world.
Before we go too far down that road, what about the other figures you mentioned, like Vico Kant and Hegel?
Sure.
How do they contribute to this story of logos?
Well, they each bring their own unique perspective to the table.
Okay.
But there's a common thread running through their work.
Okay.
A growing skepticism about our ability to grasp objective truth.
That skepticism feels like a recurring theme in this journey of logos.
It is.
First, it was the nominalists questioning the reality of universals.
Right.
And now we have these modern philosophers casting doubt on our ability to access objective truth at all.
You're picking up on a key point.
Okay.
This growing skepticism about objective truth is a central challenge to the traditional concept of logos. And it's a challenge that continues to shape our world today.
I'm starting to see how Jones connects the dots between these philosophical developments and the crisis of meaning that many people feel in the modern world.
Yeah.
Like, if we can't even agree on what's true, then how do we find meaning or purpose?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And it's one that Jones explores in depth as he moves into the 20th century and examines how this erosion of logos manifests in areas like science, sexuality, and culture.
Okay, I have a feeling things are about to get really interesting and maybe a little controversial.
Yeah.
Before we jump into that, I think it's worth taking a moment to recap what we've covered so far.
Sure. We've traced the journey of logos from its origins in ancient Greece through its various transformations across different cultures and intellectual movements. We've seen how it shaped our understanding of reality, influenced the development of science, and faced challenges from both within and outside religious traditions.
It's quite a journey.
It has.
And I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear what Jones has to say about the fate of logos in the 20th century and beyond.
Right.
So join us for part 3, where we'll explore some of the most provocative and timely aspects of Jones's analysis. Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
We've been on quite a journey with this idea of logos.
Yeah, it has been.
And honestly, I'm a little nervous about where we're headed next.
Oh, yeah.
Jones is known for tackling some pretty controversial topics, and I have a feeling this last part of our deep dive is going to get intense.
You're not wrong.
Okay.
This is where his analysis gets really thought-provoking.
Okay.
Maybe even unsettling for some listeners.
Okay.
He connects the decline of logos to some of the most, heated debates of our time.
Okay. Like what?
The sexual revolution.
Okay.
What he calls the culture of death.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
Those are some loaded terms.
They are.
And I'm curious to hear how Jones ties them into this whole story of logos.
Yeah.
Let's start with the sexual revolution.
He seems to be suggesting it's not just about changing sexual norms, but something much deeper.
Exactly. Jones argues that the sexual revolution, it represents a really profound shift in how we understand reality itself.
Right.
It's a symptom of this fragmentation of logos, where objective truth and moral frameworks get replaced by subjective experience and personal preference.
So it's not just about who you love or how you express your sexuality.
Right.
It's about a fundamental shift in how we make sense of the world and our place in it.
Precisely. And this shift has huge implications for how we understand human nature, family, and the foundations of society as a whole.
Okay.
Jones argues that by disconnecting sexuality from its natural purpose, from procreation and family, the sexual revolution has unleashed these forces that are ultimately destructive to both individuals and to society.
Okay. I'm starting to see how he's making that connection.
Okay.
But I'm sensing there's more to it than just the sexual revelation.
Yeah.
What does he mean by this culture of death?
Yeah.
It sounds pretty ominous.
He's referring to a set of values and practices that he sees as increasingly dominant in the modern world.
Okay, like what kind of values and practices?
Well, things like abortion, euthanasia, and a general devaluation of human life.
Okay.
And he argues that these practices, They're the logical outcome of a worldview that has lost sight of the inherent dignity and sanctity of human life.
So he's drawing a direct line from the decline of logos to these life and death issues.
Exactly. He's arguing that when we lose sight of objective truth and moral frameworks, when everything becomes a matter of personal preference and subjective experience, then even the most fundamental values like the right to life become negotiable.
I can see how that's a deeply troubling conclusion.
Yeah.
And one that many people would strongly disagree with.
For sure.
But let's stick with Jones's argument for a moment.
Okay.
How does he support this claim about the connection between logos and this so-called culture of death?
Well, he really delves into the intellectual and cultural history of these issues and traces the trends that have led to our current situation.
Okay.
He points to figures like Nietzsche, Freud, and Foucault,
Okay.
who in their own ways challenged traditional morality and paved the way for a more relativistic and individualistic worldview.
But aren't those figures often celebrated as champions of, like, individual freedom and liberation?
They are.
How does Jones turn them into the bad guys in this story?
Well, he's not necessarily saying they were villains,
Okay.
but he's arguing that their ideas, while well-intentioned, had unintended and often negative consequences.
Okay.
He sees their critique of traditional morality as contributing to the fragmentation of logos and the rise of a culture that devalues human life.
So it's less of a good guys versus bad guys narrative and more of a cautionary tale.
Exactly.
Like he's saying, look, even good intentions can have unintended consequences.
That's a good way to put it. He's urging us to think critically about the ideas that shape our culture, to be aware of the potential downsides of even the most seemingly liberating philosophies.
That's a message I can get behind.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line.
Right.
And that we need to be mindful of the trade-offs involved in any cultural or societal shift.
For sure.
So after taking us on this whirlwind tour of intellectual history and raising some serious concerns about the fate of logos, where does Jones leave us?
Yeah.
Does he offer any hope?
He doesn't offer any, easy solutions.
Okay.
But he does suggest that the key to restoring a sense of meaning and purpose in a logos-deprived world lies in rediscovering the sources of meaning that have been lost or neglected.
Okay.
He points to the enduring wisdom of the Western philosophical and religious traditions as a potential antidote to the nihilism and despair that he sees as so pervasive in modern culture.
So return to tradition, to those foundational values that have grounded Western civilization for centuries.
That's part of it, but it's not about blindly clinging to the past.
Right.
It's about critically engaging with those traditions, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, and adapting them to the challenges of our time.
It sounds like a tall order.
It is.
But also a vitally important one.
Absolutely.
If we want to address the challenges that Jones has so vividly laid out, we need to be willing to do the hard work of rediscovering those sources of meaning and purpose.
I agree. And while Jones's analysis can be challenging, it's ultimately a call to action.
Okay.
He's urging us to engage in deep thinking, to question our assumptions, and to seek out sources of wisdom that are often overlooked in our fast-paced, technologically driven world.
I think that's a really powerful message to end on.
Yeah.
This deep dive into logos has been eye-opening, challenging, and ultimately, I think, hopeful.
Me too.
It's a reminder that ideas matter, that history matters, and that we all have a responsibility to engage with these big questions that shape our world.
I couldn't agree more. And for those who are ready to take the plunge, I highly recommend checking out Logos Rising, A History of Ultimate Reality.
Yeah.
It's a dense and thought-provoking book, but well worth the effort.
It's a deep dive in itself?
It is.
Well, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing